I hope you enjoyed the first half of this conversation. This portion is the live technical interview with our guest. Feel free to follow along and create a solution of your own. All right, well, welcome back, Ben. The ball is in your court now. Time to move on to the technical portion of the show.
All right. So like I said earlier, I don't lean very hard on writing code in interviews because I find that you get too laser focused on sort of one small problem, and I don't get a good broad understanding of the candidate. So what I like to start with is a sort of high level problem that we can kind of meander our way through. And so if I were to say let's create an online version of the game Monopoly. Okay. Where would you start?
Interesting. I guess I would have clarifying questions, which would be, we're looking for maybe something in browser that is multiplayer.
Yes.
And would it be multiplayer just within our browser setting, or were we trying to connect with people online?
Let's say we'll start for our MVP. We'll start two people playing on the same machine, which probably no one would actually do, but then we will very quickly want to make this multiplayer. So
okay. So design with that in mind at some point. Interesting. And maybe somewhat arbitrary, but officially Monopoly licensed. So we're not trying to recreate, the wheel of how Monopoly works and slightly edit it so we don't get sued.
Yeah, let's say, let's say it is officially Monopoly licensed.
Okay, great. Then I guess my thoughts then go to, there's a couple different areas where, I guess, big areas. One would be, the kind of front end design focused assets, right? There's going to be a lot of assets that are involved. That's something that would be a pretty significant piece. I don't know if that would necessarily be first, because we could have kind of placeholders for a lot of that. Maybe have a rough idea of what we know what the board looks like, right? Or at least in theory, what the board should look like, right?
Yeah, let's say we're not worried too much about high fidelity designs yet. We want to prove that we can build this. Okay,
great. So then there's, I think the two big pieces. Other big pieces are building basically a functional front end, but then this is very much going to be a rules based game, right? We're gonna, in my mind, it's almost like kind of large system of classes that we're going to have to implement different rules that interact with each other quite a bit. So there's a lot of complexities that would go into that.
Okay.
That's was that your original question? Was kind of where do we start?
Yeah, I would say where would you start if you wanted to? Yeah, maybe I can give you a little more guidance here. Say we're still sort of just plotting out the kind of technical complexities, looking for what's the big lift here. So maybe tell me a little more about what you see as the complexities in the rules, and maybe other elements you see before we get into anything too narrow focused.
Yeah, I guess from a technical perspective, complexity in the rules, we're going to have some system of players, right? That have to be represented somehow. We're going to have some system of turns. It's going to have to be represented. I guess pieces of or kind of spots on the board, right? And then within the board itself, there's kind of each one of those different pieces have kind of different layers of complexity, right? Because you have sets of properties in Monopoly, and then on top of those you can add different variables or criteria like houses or hotels, right? And then players interact with those. I think of other big complexities. There's obviously some type of random, what are those, community chest, as well as the other cards, like those are chance cards. Like that's a kind of a random element. That seems less maybe complex. I think of other big pieces. And then I guess there's kind of the idea of a revolution of the board, which might be interesting to implement too. I guess you have a certain number of spaces on the board, right? And then every time a player goes around that, in my mind, we'd almost have to reset some aspect of like they kind of started over now, right?
Yeah.
Which is
let's dig into that a little bit. How would you represent the board, say in the database, and the movement around the board in like sort of let's design the mechanism of moving around the board front to back.
Yeah. Front to back meaning front end to back.
Meaning, yeah, front end. Say like let's start with the well, I know where I would start, but if you are start either at the UI and work your way back to the database, or start with the database schema and you work your way to the UI, whichever you feel more comfortable doing.
Yeah. Let's try front to back. Maybe let's try back to front. From a schema perspective, if we're talking about representing the board and then kind of moving around that board. So in my mind, in a schema, we're going to have yes, I'm trying to think of the best identifier, but let's say properties, which would be the actual places on the board, and each of those would have different elements, which could be something like houses, which could be an integer, or hotels, which could be an integer. Trying to think if it makes sense to have some type of like in use function, right, on the schema. Basically if the space is occupied or not. Oh, and I guess owner, it would need to have an owner, or if it's owned at all, right? Because someone can purchase that.
Okay. Can someone purchase every space on the board?
No. So there'd be some spaces, I guess that could be set to false by default, like has owner, and then some of them are editable and some of them are not. Or I guess in a different layer, we kind of add the ability to purchase them, right? To set that to purchased by someone. Otherwise, I don't know if it makes sense to have kind of almost an owner, which is just Monopoly itself represented. Like, what is it? The ones that electric tax, the electric.
Yes, there are utilities and railroads and properties. I guess utilities and railroads, I should have brushed up on my Monopoly rules before this.
Yeah.
You can own utilities and you can own the railroads. You can own properties, but then there's like community chest and jail and start and
parking,
a bunch of those free parking. So that have like various special capabilities.
Yes. Interesting. Yeah, I think those would probably be the, I guess, edge cases. Would be interesting because like jail, and then I think the opposite corner is go to jail, right? So those would be almost linked in some way, and would kind of need their own criteria for how they operate that would be unique to all the rest of them.
So how might you implement those special criteria for each sort of category of spaces?
That's a good question. I mean, if I'm thinking of a backend, I'm most familiar with Ruby on Rails. So I think what I would be thinking of is, we're going to build classes for each of these different properties, or at least the idea of a property. And then within these classes, we may have specific They may even have their own class. I guess that's what I'm trying to think about, if it makes sense to have its own, like it has like a we have a properties class, and then if we have individual properties have their own classes that belong to properties, that could make sense.
It's been probably 10 years since I've worked with Rails. How much does Rails rely on the notion of interfaces versus inheritance, or can it?
Great question that I don't have an answer for. I know
Okay.
inheritance, I believe, is what I'm more familiar with, but it's something that that's like interacting with often.
Okay.
There's a lot of, I think most of the stuff that I'm doing is either has to or has many or belongs to relationship, and depending on the complexity of the application, many of those relationships.
Sure.
So I think inheritance may be your answer there.
Okay.
More important.
Well, so those are different. Belongs to and has many. Those are relationships versus extending a class would be inheritance.
Okay.
And then interfaces, and again, I don't haven't used Rails in forever, so I don't remember how much this is sort of. I would be surprised if there wasn't a way to use interfaces, but it's basically a set of capabilities. You say like, this class implements this interface, and then you have to implement, like, it will throw an error if you do not implement certain methods and properties on that class. So that gives you some safety around how you can use that class. If you know it implements this interface, it has these available properties and methods.
Yeah.
But it sounds like inheritance is a mechanism you're more familiar with. So let's say you have a base class of space, of like board space, and you're going to extend that base class into a couple of different types of spaces. How might you do it?
Yeah. So space, I think the first one I would extend it into is properties. Right. So
well, let's start first with like what is on the base class? What would every space implement?
Interesting. I'm trying to think of what would be involved with every space. Yeah, it's interesting to think of how we would represent these things, right? But basically the capacity to land on that space, right? I don't know exactly how to word that, but basically like to occupy that space, right?
What occupies that space?
I was going to say a player, but I guess a player's piece or player's, sure. Yeah, piece.
Okay. So what does that represent?
A user?
Well, no, I mean like what if you have a model for a player's piece, yes, and you have a space that can be occupied by that piece,
yeah,
how might you implement that relationship?
Like a player's piece would have its own class, or players' pieces would have their own.
Yeah, let's say yes. The piece has its own class. The piece, yes, can be.
Yeah. I don't know if I.
So if the piece, if you're going to say, so you've got a model for the space, you've got, I think it's probably like 40 spaces around the board. And you've got a player. That player occupies a space, or that piece, excuse me. That's a good distinction you drew about the difference between a player and a piece. If you have that piece model is represented in the database somewhere.
Yes.
How do you represent in the database that piece is on this space?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, at some point, it makes sense to me that we could have a point on the schema on the pieces part of the schema that would say is occupied, right? And then we could fill in that record with whatever the player name might be, or however we're representing that player name.
And then on the other side, what do you want to know for the piece?
I guess the ID of what board piece that is, or what property space piece that would be.
Mm-hmm.
Space that would be, yeah.
Okay. And so have you considered the fact that multiple pieces might exist on the same space?
Right. Interesting. It doesn't actually impact anything, right? If I'm remembering Monopoly correctly, like there's no...
I don't think so.
So having the capacity of, I guess, is occupied is a weird way to word it, but occupied by, right? And there could be more than one on that space. That makes more sense to me.
So if we're actually just not even worrying about the models yet, if nothing in Ruby code, and you're just looking at your database schema, you're just like open up, let's say we're using Postgres, you just like open up Postgres and query the tables that you have. You have a pieces table and you have a spaces table. What are the columns on those tables that will help, that you can use to model this relationship?
Yeah. So a pieces table is going to have IDs, like their own IDs. Likewise, the spaces table will have their own IDs. And then I'm trying to think if we can have basically piece ID. Like on the spaces column, we could have piece ID as well. Basically, if a piece is on it, we can add that ID to it.
Does that account for having two pieces or three pieces or multiple pieces?
Not really. We could. No.
Yeah. So this is a pretty typical one-to-many relationship.
Yeah.
Does that help at all?
Yes. Let me think about it. I'm trying to visualize a schema in my head.
We're at a little bit of a disadvantage here because you don't have a whiteboard to scribble on, I guess.
Yeah.
I have one behind me if that's helpful. You could talk me through it. I wouldn't mind scribbling.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of if in my head, I know the difference between how a one-to-many or how that relationship is represented in a database.
Okay. How would you represent it in Rails? I'm sure that there are methods for setting up your models in this way. What would you use to define these relationships? Because it does a lot of that magic for you, I'm sure.
Yes.
So what would you use in the model?
Yeah, in the pieces or in the spaces model, I think it's literally be spaces has many pieces. And then in the pieces model, it would be pieces has one space, right? Because it can only occupy one space at a time.
Sure.
For each space, which that's like literally a one line statement.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure. I'm applying other ORMs I've used. I mostly work in Node. My guess would be there is a semantic distinction between belongs to and has one. Do you know what that is? Or let's say if I told you in another ORM, there was a distinction between that. Can you, and it's, even if you're taking just kind of an educated guess, do you have
belongs to
any idea about it?
Versus has one. Belongs to has many. I don't know. I know I've had other relationships. I worked on something somewhat recently that was has one relationship, but I don't know exactly what. So you're saying the belongs to piece might be different in.
Yeah, it's the distinction is which table in the database holds the foreign key.
Right.
So in this setup, what you've created is the table for pieces should have a space ID column. Yeah. And the spaces table shouldn't probably have any until you maybe need to optimize and create and create duplicate keys across. Then the spaces column should not, or the spaces table should not have any index around or any foreign key on the pieces, because it is a one-to-many space to pieces relationship.
Yes.
So then in your ORM, by defining those relationships, it is taking care of the queries for find me. If you say space, find me all the pieces that have foreign key of my space ID.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. So we've got our relationship set up there. Let's say how would you manage the movement of the piece around the board? How would you represent the spaces and their sort of relationship to each other, and how would you manage the movement?
Yeah. It's interesting because I'm thinking of the best. I mean, something obviously would be editing, or can be, it will be reflected on the UI, and obviously we can, if we're hitting dice rolls, that's kind of coming through. It's some type of randomized system. Interesting though. I don't know if
Well, let's start with the spaces. How do you represent the spaces and their position on the board?
I guess we could have, each space is going to have some type of ID that then, I guess each space will have some, I don't know, reflective properties, right? It's going to have the type of, whatever it's a type of grouping that it's under, and then it's going to have a name.
Okay, sorry, let me clarify. Don't worry at all about what kind of space it is. If you're just creating the mechanism, you have 40 spaces around the edge of a board, and you just want to be able to roll dice and move pieces around those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
What are you going to do? Like how might you start implementing that?
I don't know if I know. Where are we in the, I guess, where would we be talking within the stack? I guess I think I'm having difficulty.
Okay, let's start with the database schema.
Yeah.
You're going to need to represent these spaces in the database.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they are ordinal in some way, right? You start at this one, you go to the next one, the next one, the next one, the next one. How would you do that?
Yeah, I guess we would probably need some type of board. You would need a board schema as well, which the spaces could relate to, and a board class could have different properties for each space. So the spaces.
So what?
Yeah.
what would be the property you would want there? So if I say I'm on this space here and I roll a 6, how do I know what I should go to?
Whatever the current, basically we could have some type of current space property, right? And then we're going to get that ID, then take that ID, add 6 to it, right? And then look for whatever that ID would be, or look for the ID that would be 6 incremented from it. If we're talking each space is linear from 1 to 40 around the board.
Sure. So the IDs, we might use a different identifier for the specific ID of it, but it might have like a separate column for, board index or position, board position, something like that. Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So what might you use for the dice roll? Like how could you implement the dice roll? We're using 2 dice.
Yeah. We could
have true, but in our game, we're using 2.
We could have some type of, math-based function that's called basically a user would get 1 turn per round, and then they're able to, basically that function would be called by the user.
Mm-hmm. And what would it return?
The piece, some number, random full integer between, I guess, 2 and 12, if that's the dice.
And would they be evenly distributed?
Oh, interesting. I guess we would need basically 2 6s that would be returned, right? And then kind of added to it. Oh, right. Because there is, I forgot, within Monopoly, if you get doubles, there's different rules. So you'd really want 2 6s, right, being represented. And then we want to actually know the individual integers as well, rather than just knowing the total number.
And where should the code for that dice roll live? In the front end or the back end?
Probably the back end. If I was writing it might be the front end. First thought, right? Because
why do you say?
Well, I feel like it'd be easy to code up return a random string or a random integer function on the front end. And really even to make it be visualized pretty easily. I think the difficulty would be then, really not even the difficulty, but then we just have to pass it backwards to the back end.
Okay. There's also one very, very pressing reason that it should live on the back end.
Because we want to update our current board position regularly.
So if you did it on the front end, what would be the mechanism for passing it to the back end?
A JavaScript function?
Sure. So it would just send some request to an endpoint that said this is what I rolled, right?
Mm-hmm. I guess that's very unsecure.
Yeah.
a
Pop
younger
open
Taylor,
my console and be like, yeah, I rolled right over to go again. Another $200.
A lot of people didn't know you could roll exactly the amount to hit go every time.
Look at that. I just rolled a 27. Right?
Yes. That makes sense.
Cool.
Cool.
All right. Let's go one more. What would you do if you're you've got an endpoint that is going to return, the result of your roll.
Mm-hmm.
Say you are now, you're at position number 37 of 40. I can't remember exactly how many. There's about 40 spaces.
Yeah. And
you roll an 8, and so you have to round the corner. You're going to pass go. Mm-hmm. How do you represent that you it's an edge case in your roll and move to the next space? How do you handle that logic?
Yeah, I think would have to be, I'm thinking of like, I just don't know the best way to represent we have your current space ID. If it hits 40, then basically we need a way to reset it to 0, and then it would continue to add whatever the remainder of that dice roll is, right?
Right.
I'm trying to think of the best way to represent that, though. Interesting. We're almost going to have several rules, right? Because every time 40 is hit, many things are going to happen, right? They're going to collect go or collect 200. We have to reset current position. Interesting. I don't know. What would be?
So say you're not even concerned with pass and go or anything that has to happen there. What's just like the simplest implementation if you're going around a board every time you get past 40, it resets? Do you have you ever worked with anything like that? And that sort of
I mean, just like some type of loop. That's what I'm thinking.
Well, it doesn't have to be a loop. It could be, you're just going to, you have 37 and you add 8 and you want the result to be 5 instead of 45.
Yeah. There's some type of, I'm thinking of, from a code perspective, some type of if condition, right? If above 40, then, current position equals 0, and then current position plus equals dice roll.
Would current position be 0? This is actually hard to do without looking at code. But
if board position, I want board position. Oh, current position would equal, the remainder, right?
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Nice. There you go.
Cool.
I feel like I put you through the ringer on this one.
No, it's interesting. I think it's always interesting trying different styles of interviewing. And I recently did more of like a systems design interview, and I feel like this is somewhat in the same realm. And I feel like those are ones that I struggle with quite a bit, because I'm like, I feel like sometimes I can, if you just give me a return a string type question, like that's something that I've practiced enough, versus this where it's like, oh, I don't know how many of these conversations I've been in at work, right? And then when I'm thinking of my own stuff, often it's like for this one specific use case, which I think is more difficult for me to abstract to like, oh, how would I do that generally, right? Versus how did I implement this 5 times on different projects that I worked on, right?
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah. I mean, this is why I tell everyone, just like keep a side project, like get good at turning abstract ideas into concrete reality and understanding like what are those steps so that you can talk about them, if nothing else, so that you can talk about them, but also because it's fun to have a side project.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can find the time, right?
Yeah, exactly. Tell me about it.
Great. Well, Ben, as we wrap up here, anything else you want to share with folks, or anything you want to plug?
No, you can find me at benwilhelm.com. I'm social media phobic, so that's about the only place I am online right now. But that's what I'll plug, I guess, since you prompted. But this has been great, Taylor. This is fun. I like giving an interview where the stakes are low.
Yeah, well, I like doing interviews where stakes are low, right?
Yeah.
Well, I've enjoyed it, and I will plug, or I'll put your website in the show notes, and then I'll also, I think people can, if they find you on LinkedIn, you're still doing, kind of, I don't know what you call them, webinars, right? Where you're
webinars. I think I'm probably going to be shifting up the format a little bit soon, just to be able to make them a little more widely available. Yeah, it's my time only scales linearly.
Sure.
So I think rather than doing repeat webinars as I've been doing, I think I'm going to be packaging those up that people can, get them on demand. And then when I want to do a new one, I'll do those live once or twice and then package those up and move on. So
nice. You heard it here. Find Ben Wilhelm online and get his courses because they're great, or at least find a way to participate in them. Great. Well, thanks so much. It's been a blast.
Yeah. Thanks, Taylor. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcasting app at The Professional Technical Interviewee. I want to thank my guest and my wonderful editor and producer, Dustin Bays. If you're interested in sharing your technical interview advice and being on the show, please reach out at dorsetttaylordev@gmail.com. Until next time, keep practicing.